Imagine being 16 years old and agreeing to spend a quiet night alone in a large suburban house. The neighborhood is calm, the streets are empty, and everything feels safe. Your aunt and uncle have asked you to house sit for the weekend while they are away. It seems simple. Just watch the house. Maybe invite your boyfriend over so you're not alone. Watch some movies and go to sleep. Nothing about the night feels dangerous. But somewhere nearby, two people are already planning something terrifying. They are not strangers hiding in the shadows. They are not mysterious intruders. They are people you know, people you trust. People who have already decided that tonight they want to turn real life into a horror movie. This is the true story of the murder of Cassie Jo Stoddart, a 16-year-old girl whose quiet night turned into one of the most disturbing true crime cases in the United States. And what makes the story even darker is that the killers, Draper and Torey Adamcik, didn't just commit the crime. They filmed themselves planning it, like they were directing their own horror film. The story begins in the quiet town of Pocatello. It's the type of place where people feel safe walking outside at night, where neighbors greet each other, and where violent crime is extremely rare. Families raise their children, believing nothing truly bad could happen in a place like this. Cassie Stoddart was just a normal teenager living in this quiet town. She went to school, spent time with friends, and had a boyfriend she cared about. Teachers and friends described her as kind, responsible, and polite. She wasn't someone who got into trouble. She was someone adults trusted. That trust is why her aunt and uncle asked her to stay at their house while they were away for the weekend. The house was large and located in a quiet neighborhood just outside the center of town. They needed someone responsible to watch over it, and Cassie seemed like the perfect person. On the evening of September 22, 2006, Cassie arrived at the house. The sun was starting to set, and the quiet neighborhood looked peaceful. She planned to stay overnight and keep the place safe until her relatives returned. Since the house was big and empty, Cassie invited her boyfriend over so she wouldn't feel lonely. To them, it felt like a small adventure. Two teenagers spending a night watching movies in a quiet house. At first, everything went exactly as expected. They watched movies, talked, and relaxed in the living room. It felt like any normal evening. But earlier that day, two other teenagers had already been thinking about this house. Those teenagers were Draper and Torey Adamcik. Both boys attended the same school as Cassie. They were known for being fascinated with horror movies, especially the famous film Scream. In that movie, masked killers stalk victims like characters in a game. But for Brian and Torey, horror movies weren't just entertainment. They were inspiration. The two boys had started discussing the idea of committing a real murder, not because they hated someone, and not because they were angry. They wanted to do it because they thought it would feel like being inside a horror movie. At some point, they decided that Cassie would be the victim. The most disturbing part is that they recorded themselves talking about it before the murder happened. Sitting in a room with a small camera recording, they spoke about their plan in an excited tone, as if they were discussing a school project. Draper even said that they were going to make their own horror movie. That night, the two boys went to the house where Cassie was staying. They arrived while Cassie and her boyfriend were there, acting like normal friends visiting. Cassie welcomed them inside. Nothing about their behavior seemed strange at first. They walked around the house, talked casually and spent time with the group. But while they were inside, they were secretly studying the layout of the house. They looked at doors, hallways, and rooms. They were figuring out where they could hide. After a while, the boys left the house. At least, that's what Cassie believed. But instead of going home, Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik waited nearby. When they were sure nobody was watching, they returned to the house and quietly entered again through an unlocked door. Now the real plan was about to begin. The boys moved silently through the dark house. They wanted to create fear before the attack, just like in their favorite horror movies. So they began sabotaging the house. They turned off lights and power. They locked doors. They moved quietly into the basement and hid there. Upstairs, Cassie and her boyfriend soon noticed something strange. The lights suddenly stopped working, and parts of the house went dark. At first they thought it might just be a power problem. Maybe a fuse had blown, or maybe there was an electrical issue. But the house started to feel different. The silence became heavy. Cassie began to feel uneasy, like something wasn't right. Her boyfriend tried to calm her down, but after a while, he needed to leave for the night. Cassie asked him to stay because the dark house was starting to scare her, but he eventually left, promising that everything would be fine. As his car disappeared down the quiet street, Cassie was now alone in the large house. Except she wasn't actually alone. Downstairs in the darkness, two people were still waiting. The moment the boyfriend left, Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik knew the time had come. They slowly came out from their hiding place in the basement. The house was almost completely dark, lit only by faint light coming through the windows. Cassie was upstairs, unaware that anyone else was inside. The boys quietly moved through the house. Then they attacked. Investigators later determined that Cassie was stabbed dozens of times during the attack. She tried to defend herself, but she was alone and overpowered. The violent assault lasted only minutes. When it was over, the house was silent again. Cassie Jo Stoddart, a 16-year-old girl who had simply agreed to watch a house for the night, was dead. But what happened after the murder shocked investigators even more. Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik ran back to their car. Instead of panicking or showing fear, they turned on a camera and began recording themselves again. They laughed. They talked excitedly about what had just happened. Brian Draper even said directly into the camera that he had just killed Cassie. They spoke about the murder like it was a successful scene in a movie. For them, the plan had worked. They had created their own real-life horror story. The next day, Cassie's family became worried when nobody could contact her. Eventually, her relatives returned to the house. Inside, they discovered the horrifying scene. Police were called immediately, and the quiet town of Pocatello was suddenly dealing with one of the most shocking crimes it had ever seen. Detectives began investigating the case, trying to understand who could have committed such a brutal attack. At first, investigators suspected that someone from outside the neighborhood might be responsible. But as they started questioning people who knew Cassie, suspicion slowly began pointing toward Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik. Eventually, the boys were brought in for questioning. They tried to deny involvement at first, but detectives soon discovered the recorded videos the boys had made before and after the murder. Those recordings became some of the most disturbing evidence ever presented in a teenage murder case. In the videos, The boys calmly discussed their plan to kill someone. They talked about how exciting it would be, and how they wanted the experience to feel like a horror film. The recordings proved that the murder was carefully planned. When the case finally went to trial, the courtroom became silent as the jury watched the videos. They saw two teenagers laughing and discussing murder like it was entertainment. The evidence left little doubt about what had happened. Both Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik were found guilty of first-degree murder. Because they were minors at the time of the crime, they did not receive the death penalty. Instead, both were sentenced to life in prison. Today, they remain behind bars. The case still shocks people years later, not because of ghosts or supernatural elements, but because of something much more frightening. The killers were not strangers hiding in the shadows. They were ordinary teenagers who went to school, watched movies, and had friends. Yet they chose to turn someone's life into a real-life horror movie. And for many people, that reality is far more terrifying than any fictional story.